The Voice of Russia World Service welcomes you to another edition of The Christian Message from Moscow.
Было 15 лет, и я только единственное помню, встала перед иконой Матери Божией, говорю: Матери Божией, пошли мне мужа такого, которого бы ты сама себе пожелала.
I rarely attended church services. Still, I recall how once I stood before the icon of the Holy Mother of God and begged her, Mother of God, send me a husband that you yourself would wish for.
Those were the words of the person we should like to tell you about in today's edition, Muscovite Lydia Maleyeva. It's hard to say whether the Holy Virgin heard her pleas or not, but Lydia married a very well-known, in our country and abroad, clergyman and icon painter Mikhail Maleyev. In Lydia's words, he is a person of physical and spiritual beauty. She loves him a great deal, they have 2 sons, and Lydia feels she is the happiest of women. However, this happiness came to her after a great many hardships and trials. So let us listen to what Lydia Maleyeva herself told our correspondent about her path in life.
Когда мне было 15 лет, я первый раз после смерти своего отца пришла в церковь. Первое, что я спросила, а что можно на 9 дней покойника сделать доброго, хорошего?
When I was just 15, my father died. On the 9th day after his demise, I came to church and asked what good I could do for my deceased father. They suggested I order a memorial service, and I did this. Afterwards, I stood before the icons, crying bitterly. I was extremely grieved at losing my beloved father. Seeing me weeping thus, an elderly nun who served at the church altar approached me. She questioned me as to why I was crying, and I told her everything. She advised me to go to the Holy Trinity St. Sergius Monastery, not far from Moscow, to one of the local elders. She insisted the conversation with him would be most beneficial for me. However, at the time, I didn't take much heed of her advice.
Потом у меня мама очень тяжело заболела, и когда она лежала в больнице с воспалением легких.
Later, soon after father's demise, my mother fell seriously ill with pneumonia. As she lay in hospital, her neighbor in the ward was regularly visited by her sister, who for some reason took notice of me. This woman addressed my mother with the words, "You have such an excellent daughter. It would be good if she visited one very wise elder." And she went on to mention the name of that same elder that I had been referred to earlier, by that nun I encountered. Some time passed. I found employment at the Central Moscow department store as an understudy of the salesperson at the department trading in tape recorders. I didn't like my work, but after father's death, mother and I were having financial difficulties. She worked as a cook at a cafe and didn't earn much, so I was obliged to work too. Once, one of the young salesgirls who worked at the same store as I invited me over to her place. She said her mother was very good at fortune-telling with cards. I was intrigued, so I went over. We arrived at their place. The girl's mother turned out to be a very large woman with stunning blue eyes. She gazed intently at me and said, "I shall not tell your fortunes. You are a very good person, and I don't want to inflict harm on you."
И она мне рассказывает свою очень страшную судьбу. Она говорит, когда мне было 13 лет, и умирала моя бабушка-колдунья, она не могла умереть, пока меня не
And she
одели
went on to
в
tell me her
рубашку.
terrifying story. Apparently, when she was 13, her grandmother, a witch, was dying painfully and slowly. It was a sheer torture. And then she demanded that they put one of her nightshirts on me. The moment this was done, my grandmother died at last, while all her powers passed over to me. But the Lord punished me. I have a huge tumor inside me. It weighs 8 kilos, and it's still growing. The medics refuse to operate. They say surgery isn't an option in my case. I would gladly give up all this witchcraft and fortune-telling, but the moment I do so, at night, Satan comes to me and starts throttling me. So as not to die, I'm obliged to resume these witch practices again. However, you can help me. Only you can do this. Go to the Holy Trinity St. Sergius Monastery and bring me some holy water and a ribbon with the Psalm 91. I felt very sorry for this woman. Besides, this was the 3rd time that they requested I go to the Holy Trinity St. Sergius Monastery. I felt it could hardly be a coincidence, so I agreed to go there. Already on the train, I saw a woman in a black headscarf and guessed that she was probably going to the same monastery. I was proved right in my surmise when the woman got off at the same station as I. I approached her on the platform and asked her the way to the monastery. She instructed me to follow her. There were several churches on the premises of the monastery. The woman told me which church I needed to go to, adding, "If you find it closed, come to me at the seminary, where I serve as altar woman." Indeed, the church I was looking for turned out to be closed. It was rather late, and so I set off to find my train acquaintance over at the cemetery. She gave me some holy water and a ribbon with Psalm 91 for the woman practicing witchcraft. She also said, "It would do you good to confer with our elder," and she pronounced the same name that had been twice before mentioned to me. She insisted I needed this for salvation. At this point, despite my faltering faith in God at the time, I realized it was no accident, and I really ought to see the elder. My encounter with the elder took place thanks to one of my mother's friends acting as a go-between. The elder looked at me intently and said, "You have done enough trading and selling. What you ought to do is become a doctor. Go and enter the local medical college." I was surprised, but I took his advice. Besides, I had long wanted to live independently. I returned to Moscow and gave the holies to the woman sorceress. Then I told my mother that I would give up my work and go off to train to become a nurse. She said, "But you can study in Moscow too. Why go that far?" The elder instructed me to. "It must be the Lord's will," said I, "and that is where I need to go." I entered the evening department of the medical college and simultaneously found a job as a nurse's aide at a local hospital. At the elder's advice, in my free time, I looked after several very elderly nuns, victims of Stalin's reprisals. In their day they had all followed their elder, as his spiritual daughters, to his place of exile, so as not to lose his spiritual guidance and to help him in what way they could. They had suffered a lot of hardships and were all very ill, some paralyzed, some with trophic diseases and such like. They resided in individual wooden houses with their own novices. The elder blessed me to look in on them and give them medical help when needed. It wasn't easy for me, but I rejoiced in seeing that my efforts brought them relief. They all loved me and were always happy to see me. I resided with one of the nuns. Her house was old and frail. It had a stove, which I had to learn to use. I slept on an old truckle bed, and to begin with, the bedbugs attacked me mercilessly. I would even weep stealthily, but somehow I was embarrassed to complain about them to the nun, so I staunchly put up with the ordeal. Later on, I discovered that the Lord was thus testing me. But first things first. The elder directed my life and was quite severe, even though he loved me like his own daughter. Every morning I went to confession, after which he gave me his blessing. I was in that difficult teenage age when one is susceptible to all manner of bad influences. So to protect me from this, he loaded my workday mercilessly. I was so busy with good and useful deeds that I didn't have a moment's idle time.
У меня был такой день, что я утром говорю в монастырь, потом я бежала работать тогда с санитаркой. После санитарки я бежала на военное предприятие, мыла туалет.
This is how my day was spent. After morning prayers and confession, I rushed to my work at a hospital, where I was a nurse's aide. After that, I went to the local military plant to clean the lavatories there. After that I rushed to my wards, the elderly nuns, to stoke up the fires in the stoves, to cook for them and feed them. Then followed my studies at the medical college. After studies, I once again did the rounds of the nuns. After supper and evening prayers, I had to read the Psalter in full. Eventually I would go to bed only around 3 a.m., and at 6 a.m. I had to be up already to read morning prayers and rush to confession. On weekends, the elder also found errands for me to do. Thus he guarded me from temptation and sin, for which I am ever grateful to him. Of course it was hard for me, but I was so young and energetic that I had enough strength to lead such a life. Besides, I greatly loved and respected my spiritual father and obeyed him completely. It's interesting that after I had grown accustomed to praying studiously and reading the Psalter, as the elder instructed me to do, the bedbugs that had so plagued me all disappeared. This is when I was convinced of the power of prayer. I was 19 when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctors told me she would die in 2 months. Do not waste money on treatment. Keep it for the funeral, they told me. I was close to despair. One acquaintance of mine suggested I try an unorthodox but most effective cancer treatment. It was made out of an infusion of vegetable juices and bluestone. By then, I was ready to try anything. I did as best as I could to stoke up my mother's hopes for a cure. The woman who'd offered me the cure lived near the Holy Trinity Monastery. Leaving Mother at the hospital in Moscow, I told her I was off to obtain the medicine that would definitely cure her. However, the woman changed her mind and denied me the miracle cure. She was afraid, since nobody could be 100% sure it would work, all the more so when it had to do with human health. The treatment she was advocating, even though it had frequently proved effective, included a very poisonous substance, bluestone. And my mother was in such a grave state. What if it killed her? The woman feared she might be accused of murder. I could understand the reasonings of this woman, and I couldn't really blame her. But my frayed nerves gave way, and I sat weeping, inconsolably, not knowing what to tell my mother when I returned without the promised cure. It's a good thing I wasn't alone, but with a friend who insisted we go to one of the monastery churches to pray. I trailed behind her, still weeping.
И уже служба заканчивается, я вхожу в храм, и вы представляете, меня как бы справа зовет какая-то икона. Я так поворачиваю голову, я говорю: Люба, что это за икона? Он говорит: это исцелитель
The church
Пантелеймон,
service was almost over. Suddenly, I felt strongly drawn to an icon to the right. Turning in that particular direction, I saw the icon of the holy Panteleimon the healer. My friend said to me, "Pray to him, and he shall cure your mother." I scraped up my last money to buy a candle and stood on my knees before the icon, begging the saint, "Please, cure my mother, let her live." Suddenly, it was as if someone had ordered me mentally, "Take some icon lamp oil." I approached one of the old women serving in the church and asked if I could have some of the oil from the lamp in front of the icon to this particular healer saint. She responded saying she could only do so with the blessing of the clergyman. Many in the monastery knew my friend and I, so we quickly found a clergyman who was personally able to pour us some oil into a small bottle. When my friend and I were seated in the train going back to Moscow, I no longer felt despair or anxiety. My heart had found peace and hope at last. Mother had been waiting my return anxiously and was overjoyed to see me. She immediately asked if I had brought the medicine, and I responded joyfully that I had, and now all would be well. I took Mother home from the hospital. The doctors didn't object. They had pronounced their verdict. After rubbing Mother's breast with the oil I'd brought, I decided not to stop at that. I wanted to try out the treatment that woman had initially suggested, but omitting the bluestone. Instead, I tried vegetable juices infused with garlic. I began with carrot juice. Mother and I had almost completely run out of money. My neighbours offered to loan me some, though. I went to the market, but for some reason it was quite bare. There was only one man there with a heap of carrots on the counter in front of him, and I made my way towards him. I told him just how much money I had and asked how many carrots it would buy me. However, to my surprise, he offered me to take all the carrots he had left, which was quite a lot. It was quite a miracle, something I hadn't even hoped for. So I began to treat Mother, rubbing her breast with the icon lamp oil while reading prayers and giving her carrot juice with added garlic.
Пост Петра и Павла. Я говорю: мам, ты знаешь, тебе хватит лежать, ты хоть до кухни, но надо вставать, доходить. Но я как бы оптимизм.
This was during the fast in honor of the holy apostles Peter and Paul. To boost Mother's spirits, I tried to make her more optimistic and forced her to move as much as was possible in her weak state. Three or 4 days passed from the start of the treatment. I recall how she was seated in the kitchen, at the table, and suddenly she said, "Lydia, I'm hungry." Now, prior to this, she'd had no appetite whatsoever. I was so happy, I asked, "What would you like me to prepare?" Mother requested a fish broth, so that's what I cooked for her. 2 weeks later, we went to hospital for a checkup. I led Mother to the doctors and sat out in the corridor waiting. Soon, I saw a stir among the medics. People were coming and going to the doctor's office where Mother was. I became nervous, and at that point Mother emerged, her face wet with tears, but she was smiling radiantly. They were asking me what treatment I'd had, she told me. And I told them you'd been rubbing my breast with some oil. Apparently, they say I no longer have cancer. They offered me to spend 2 weeks here just in case, but I said no, I would much rather go to work. I was so happy as I thanked the Lord and the Holy Saint Panteleimon for saving my mother.
You've been listening to the story of Lydia Maleyeva, a Muscovite and a clergyman's wife, read to you by Svetlana Yakimenko. Tune in to hear the continuation of the story in the following edition of our feature, same time next week. And there we end another edition of The Christian Message from Moscow, directed by Vladimir Dermin, author and music editor Tatiana Shvetsova, sound engineer Nadezhda Smirnova, and your host Pavel Novichkov. All the very best to you, and may God save you from all evil, visible and invisible.